Hello, everyone. Can I encourage you to take a seat as quickly as possible, please? My name is Carol Mancusi-Ungaro. I'm the Associate Director of Conservation and Research at the Whitney Museum in New York, and I'm the founding director of the Center for the Technical Study of Modern Art at the Harvard University Art Museums. I apologize for our starting a few minutes late, but we've had a few technical difficulties, but I think we're ready to go now. So please take your seats. We have a very interesting, exciting program this afternoon. Our first presentation is entitled Nauman's Edge. And I think I read in the paper, New York Times, this morning that Nauman has just been named the artist for the 2009 Venice Biennial Biennale for the United States representatives. So he will be doing our pavilion, which is a good thing. We have two very distinguished people to present this talk. Pip Lawrenson is head of time-based media conservation at the Tate Museum in London, and Anne Wagner is professor of modern and contemporary art at the University of California in Berkeley. The title of their presentation is Nauman's Edge. Please join me in welcoming them.
There it is. Okay, great. So I too have thanks to give, and actually to the Getty, but also to my collaborator Pip, whose idea it was that we should work together, and I'm really grateful to you for having had this thought. So Pip and I have agreed that the way to begin our presentation is with me aiming to suggest what we mean by Nauman's Edge. Yes, a pun is intended. Yes, we both concur that if the art world were a horse race, he'd be way out in front, and indeed he's way out in front, as we learned today. We both continue to be struck, in other words, by how Nauman's work keeps rewarding our study, whether the questions we've brought to him have been those of the conservator, in Pip's case, or the art historian, in mine. But it turns out that with Nauman, those questions have important connections, even overlaps, not least where edges and structures are concerned. To speak of his edge means to summon something other than his special standing in the art world today. Edges reveal structure, but they also expose the object they define. Early on, Pip said to me that, as a conservator, they make her nervous. They are vulnerable to being chipped off, smoothed out, edited away. And for Nauman, too, the edge is fraught. It conjures a no man's land, a zone of breakdown and dysfunction, which paradoxically is the site where new ideas and sensations are sometimes able to emerge. This happens across media, in his sculpture, for example, or in video or in language-based works. In fact, we want to argue that finding or marking that edge is essential to pretty much the whole range of the artist's work, as he himself well knows. Speaking about language, for example, and its importance to him as a tool, he declared, and I'm quoting now from the transcript of an important interview conducted by Christopher Cordes over 12 years' time from 1977 to 1989, and then synthesized into a single, well, pretty much edge-free transcript for publication. It's difficult to see what the functional edges of language are. The place where it communicates best and most easily is also the place where language is the least interesting and emotionally involving, such as the functional way we understand the word sing or the sentence, pick up the pencil. When these functional edges are explored, however, other areas of your mind make you aware of language potential. I think the point where language starts to break down as a useful tool for communication is the same edge where poetry or art occurs. It certainly bears insisting that the site Nauman elects as that of art or poetry, somewhere at the frontier of utility, is a location that other artists have also sought. But few have gone after it so single-mindedly, and few have coupled that search with such thoroughgoing efforts to pinpoint the precise site of breakdown of his media, the odd shape which makes sculpture flip over into something like its opposite, a concretization of space, as it does in platform made up of the space between rectilinear boxes on the floor. A highly descriptive title, in fact, for the work you're seeing now, and one of the most assertively structured polyester and resin works he made in 1966, and he made some very assertive works indeed. In film and video works, the breakdown that happens when his film and videos, works like the 66, 67, 68 dance or exercise around the perimeter of a square, makes time and action stutter endlessly. And in language pieces, as the artist says, the unraveling happens when words start over, just at the point where, by rights, they ought to come to an end, or when they move unstably back and forth between two meanings, revealing relationships that otherwise would and maybe even could not come to mind. I would apply the first of these descriptions to Raw War, a drawing made in 1968 for a neon tubing piece that would be realized 2 years later. And as for the second, the idea of language moving back and forth between two formulations, well, there are many works to which it might be applied, including Raw War, which is palindromic, as you see, but it's also actively at work, for example, in Sweet, Sweet Substitute, a neon piece that also dates from '68. Here, as the piece endlessly reconfigures itself as one word and then another, sweet, sweet substitute, the edge of poetry may well be approached as we flip through pleasure, change, and loss, all the while wondering which comes first. In just a few minutes, Pip is going to speak in particular to ideas of edge and structure in Nauman's time and camera-based work, with the analytical depth of what she's going to offer about these kinds of works, helping to insist that we're not trying to convey that edges and structures work identically across the whole range of media that the artist deploys. On the contrary, for us, seeing the relationships among the media that we study has also involved seeing their differences. This is one thing that working together has allowed. It bears saying that I came at his work from the point of view of an historian of sculpture, and that what I was initially most interested in was the artist's love-hate relationship to that medium, the one in which at the MFA program at UC Davis he was formally schooled. In fact, Nauman still calls himself a sculptor today. That is his epithet of choice. In working on the artist, I came to see how much sculpture mattered to him, how well he had to understand it in order to refuse it in such a thoroughgoing way. Nauman, I think, really studied how sculpture works. He saw that it offers a means of description, even delimitation. It, too, deals in edges, backs, and sides. It separates itself from its surround. One reason this was so important is because to grasp these as sculpture's limit conditions can't help but raise the question of what it might mean to exceed them, which Nauman did. For him, no ontological distinction could be more salient or more open to question. And I quote Nauman, "Both what's inside and outside determine our physical, physiological, and psychological responses, how we look at an object," he declares. So what's he saying? Both that mere surfaceness will no longer be the register of sculptural meaning, and that the viewer cannot and does not respond to objects in a purely phenomenological way. What's inside and what's outside both matter, what is seen and what is invisible, as he aims to show. Surely this is part of the point of A Cast of the Space Underneath My Chair, which occupied him from 65 to 68, but also the 1968 steel slab known as Dark. Much too heavy to be lifted manually, Dark bears its title on an unseen edge. For Nauman, it was a watershed work. It was one of the first pieces he made, he wrote, and I quote, having to do with a leftover feeling. This feeling has been important in my work ever since. It's partly the idea of, given this piece of information you can't get to, there's nothing you can do about it. It's sort of like trying to think about the universe. End of quote. There's no question but that pieces like these point to a fascination with limits that leads to their opposite. We might say that Nauman's objects aim to do away with perimeters by the contradictory tactic of bringing them to light. Perhaps the issue is that without edges, we couldn't trust ourselves to tell the difference between bodies and objects or know how and where they sit within their larger envelope of space. For Nauman, edge and structure seem to mean all this and more, which is to say that in the mid-1960s, Nauman took limits seriously and followed where they led him, towards the vagaries of domestic objects and interior space. It's there that he also envisioned the body as an elusive object that several of his works aim to summon as a phantom or an absence, or perhaps better stated as an imaginative supplement to his sculptural works. This is what I think happens, for example, in Neon Template of the left half of my body taken at 10-inch intervals, and perhaps more vividly in Piece in Which One Can Stand. Both of these are from 1966. To view and respond to these pieces, it's inevitable that we bring to mind the body that is otherwise mostly absent from his sculptural work. What would it be like to insert the artist back into the so-called template of his left half? Or to see someone actually taking the cue of the floor piece and fitting her feet into the slot? The result would not only return the body to these strange gadgets, but also expose it to potential boredom, exhaustion, and risk. And this is not all. Once we see the body that has been absented from Nauman's sculpture, it's hard to wish it away. On the contrary, the work makes the body in traditional sculpture look decidedly dead. His own work, by contrast, seems to exist so as to evoke, even measure aliveness, as well as to push aliveness to a crux. His work holds the viewer hostage to the threat and the necessity of an encounter with sculpture as a frozen corpse. With this thought, however, I'll stop so as to turn over to Pip. But it's to this issue of aliveness and deadness that in discussion I hope we might be able to return.
Thank you. So I first heard Anne talk about her work exploring Nauman's early sculptures shortly after an intense period of time spent working on the conservation of the newly acquired Mapping the Studio 2 with Colour Shift, Flip-Flop, and Flip-Flop Fat Chance John Cage, and its installation at Tate Modern excuse me, in 2005. So this work has a very strong structure, and learning to install it had been a process of being taught that structure, which forms its underlying logic. So despite Nauman stating that the structure of his works were just a way of getting started, I think it remains an important part of the identity of these works and part of what I, as a conservator, should be aiming to preserve. In the case of mapping the studio, elements of the structure reveal the traces of the process and also create a set of underlying rules which dictate certain parameters to the work. Like a good archaeologist who leaves the clues to the origins of the object intact in its traces of dirt and markings, the conservation of these works perhaps requires a similar approach. So, struck by Anne's exploration of the notion of the edge in Nauman's sculpture, I began to think about Nauman's edges in his time-based media works of art, with particular reference to mapping the studio too. In his sculpture, the exposure of the edges reveals the boundaries between the object and negative space. In this respect, sculpture is seen as a way of structuring space. Nauman's projects often explore ways of taking those structures apart and putting them back together, leaving the seams and parting lines to reveal his process. And I quote, "Negative space for me is thinking about the underside and the backside of things. In casting, I always like the parting lines and the seams, things that help to locate the structure of the object, but in the finished sculpture usually get removed." So edges in time-based media works of art are about edges between the frame and the events on the one hand, as captured by a recording device, and the perpetual flow of everything that happens on the other. In exploring ways of structuring time, Nauman reveals his process by exposing the structure of the act of recording and the means by which the work is built. There are edges which reveal the constraints imposed by characteristics or limits of the media employed, and there are edges which reveal the almost mathematical or perhaps even quasi-musical structures which are employed in his more complex installations as part of this process of making the work. Just as sculptures look at the organization across points in space, the time-based media works look at organization of events across points in time. There is little editing in Nauman's works. The camera is most commonly used as a static, passive eye, capturing everything that happens before it, limited by what falls within the frame of the lens and the duration of the media. There is one striking exception to this, and that is Violent Incident from 1986, a 4-channel video installation spread over 12 monitors. Here Nauman uses the camera to track the action of his tightly choreographed situation. 2 of the channels show the acted scenario with the roles reversed by the 2 protagonists, and I'm just going to show you a clip with this. The other 2 channels, to paraphrase Nauman, take this action apart and expose a complex array of possibilities by the use of slow motion, time references, and the use of footage from rehearsals.
Seconds. 1 minute, 15 seconds. 1 minute, 20 seconds.
Okay. As in the mapping the studio, none of the different channels are synchronized, so the combination of images forms what Nauman has described as creating an infinite variety of relationships and things that can happen. Nauman's footage, his raw materials, if you like, are often manipulated after they've been recorded by changing the orientation, the colour, or the speed. And this is a chart done by Michael Short, who works for Speroni Westwater and works closely with Bruce Nauman. And what he's done is he's charted all the flips and the flops and the colour shifts in Mapping the Studio 2. Nauman's exploration of the ways of structuring time are usefully seen against a backdrop of the influence of the writings of John Cage and the music of Lamont Young, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, and Philip Glass. At the University of Wisconsin, Nauman attended classes on musical theory. Nauman also points to the influence of Warhol in the idea of films which just go on, and 8 hours later are still going on. And I quote, "I like that idea very much. It also comes from some of the music that I was interested in at the time. The early Phil Glass pieces and Lamont Young, whose idea was that music was something that was there. That kind of way of structuring time. So part of it is not just an interest in the content, the image, but a way of filling a space and taking up time." Nauman's time-based media works fill space and take up time in different ways. When Nauman used video for the first time to capture his studio exercises in 1968 with slow-angle walk, Beckett walk, he was able to move from 10 minutes as his maximum duration, dictated by the limits of the 400-foot film canister, to 1 hour, which was the duration of his videotape. The camera is turned on its side, making the viewer conscious of the eye of the lens and of what is outside the frame. At times, Nauman, doing his rhythmic, slow-angle walk, leaves the frame, leaving the action audible but visually inaccessible. At the end of the hour, the picture turns to noise, indicating the end of the tape. I'm very glad to say that nothing has been done to tidy up these ends and produce a seamless loop, although, of course, the technology has now become available. Instead, the ends remain ragged, suggesting that the activity continued to go on but was no longer recorded. Timelessness recast as simply a continuing thing. With film, Nauman was able to create loops using an 8mm cassette system. And these works, for example, Spinning Spheres of 1970, are about creating something where nothing would change. You could come in and leave and come back, and the abstracted activity would still be going on seamlessly. Then, in Mapping the Studios, both 1 and 2 from 2001, we are exposed to day-long durations. One enters into a very particular physical and temporal twilight environment, which by its scale and sound engulfs the viewer. Recording introduced what the theorist Attali has called the ability to stockpile time. Like a sculpture, the installation takes up continuous space and time. Liz Kotz, in her paper Post-Cagean Aesthetics and the Event Score, points us to the introduction of Kittler's gramophone film typewriter, where the translators Winthrop and Young and Hertz write the following on the aesthetics of indifference. Here they note that both the gramophone and film recorded indiscriminately what was within the range of the microphones or camera lenses, and both thereby shifted the boundaries that distinguished noise from meaningful sounds, random visual data from meaningful picture sequences. So, here are some of our time-based edges as revealed in Nauman's work. The limits of the media used, the boundary between what is inside and outside the frame, or the boundary between presence and absence, the boundary between noise or everything that happens and meaningful sounds or a specific event, the boundary between what is recorded and what is not. In Mapping the Studio 2, we see all of these edges revealed. Firstly, the work reveals the limits of the media used. Each channel was originally made up of 6 hours of video, each of which was shot in 1-hour sessions, the length of his tapes. On different nights during the weeks, Nauman was working on the piece. So each hour is marked by Nauman, who, having set up the camera, leaves the room. So these moments are not edited out, but instead are left in to indicate how the work is stitched together. The texture of the images comes from the use of basic digital camcorder in night vision mode. The pixels that make up the images are constantly moving. There is a lot of digital noise, and this is amplified by their scale. Nauman is interested in this noise and was concerned that MPEG-2 compression used to make a DVD would smooth this out. In order to capture the image in low light levels, the traces of light onto the CCD in the camera is slowed, meaning movement appears a little jumpy and objects attract with this trail of light. Night vision mode employs near-infrared light and operates on the edge of the visible spectrum. Remarking on the effects of different media, Nauman has noted how different the digital noise of a constantly moving pixels is from either film or a normal taped image. Instead, he says there is texture all the time. The microphone on the camera used to make the work had an automatic gain control to boost low signals. This picks up sounds that may not usually be heard by the human ear, or ambient background sounds that we would not normally be aware of. The dominant sound is the hum of the air conditioning units in Nauman's studios, but other incidental noises, such as when the moths fly close to the microphone or the artist's cat, can also be heard, as can noise from outside the studio, a coyote in the distance, a train, or a thunderstorm. The sound is surprisingly loud. It's been made up of all of the 7 separate channels of audio playing at the same time. The result sounds like audio noise, on a par with the noise of the images, with occasional events such as the cry of the cat being picked out. The images show areas of Nauman's studio with the remains of various projects, reminding us of codification from 1966, a document which acts as a blueprint for Nauman's artistic activity and which lists traces of activities such as footprints and material objects as the 4th entry. In mapping the studio, we'd see Nauman literally leave, but we also see evidence of his presence in uncompleted projects lying around the studio. And here you can see some of his wax head, a text piece on the wall, and perhaps those are casts from some of his animals. And there goes the mouse. We also see his chair, where he watches his videos, the very aura of the artist's studio, marking the edge between presence and absence. Every morning, as a meditative exercise, Nauman went through the tape he made the night before, and in a notebook recorded the events, for example, mouse on door, against a time code. And these are shots from the notebooks which are now in Tate's collection. He has likened recording events in this way to the journals of Lewis and Clark, in that although there is a lot of repetition, every day something happens. It was the experience of reading these journals that prompted Nauman to look at what was around him, map or create an analogue of the studio, just keeping a record of what he observed. The diary as a means of ordering time by recording events against the perpetual flow of everything that happens. So alongside these notebooks are the logbooks, which are more complete working log of events, divided by tape and timecode to indicate the footage for each DVD. These, again, can be shown alongside the work, again acting as a tool to reveal the structure. We know that Nauman read Wittgenstein, and in paragraph 435 of the investigations, Wittgenstein acknowledges that although it is true that nothing is hidden, and I quote, "It all goes by so quick, and I should like to see it, as it were, laid open to view." What spending time with Nauman's Mapping the Studio 2 has made me aware of is that in his investigations of time and space, he takes what is in front of us and methodically takes it apart, and by the exposure of these edges, lays it open to view. So what does this matter to the conservation of these works? Well, paying attention to the structure in many ways provides the key to their conservation, as it forms a robust underlying logic which, once seen, provides a template for what is important to preserve in the future installation of the work. Time-based media works of art have different vulnerabilities than the material vulnerabilities of traditional painting and sculpture. Last year I saw Violent Incident installed with only 3 of its 4 channels. Not understanding the structure of the work, the 3 rows of monitors each showed 1 channel, and not knowing what to do with the 4th, it was simply left out. Things like this happen because they're possible. As conservation moves from a concern with the purely physical of the work to a broader understanding of what's important to preserve, understanding these structures is as important as understanding the vulnerabilities of a pigment or a medium. It's about understanding what can go wrong, even within the museum environment, and what the consequences of this is to the work of art. Thank you. I'm now going to pass back to Anne.
So Pip and I have actually basically envisioned this part of our time with you as one which can be open to, to a collective conversation rather than us continuing our conversation. And I think that's what we want to actualize. But as we begin, I think it bears emphasizing now maybe some of the differences between our collaboration and the collaborations that whose results we've already seen the evidence of. I mean, I think that it's very striking to me how much our interrelationship happened at a conceptual level, and how useful it was to sort of trade terms and understandings of structure back and forth. And so rather than my kind of doing the historical spade work, which then, Pip puts into practice in the laboratory, it's been very different. And both of us have been, I think, in the process of, the ongoing process of thinking about Nauman's work, which is pretty rich. But it hasn't been like I do my bit and then she does her bit. And I think that we might want to offer that up as a different kind of model of the interrelationship that is particularly helpful as she is working at the frontier of this artist's work, particularly where time-based media are concerned, and where also those of us who work on contemporary art are dealing with artists who are, who practice in a post-medium world, quote unquote, but where that term really does not go any distance towards describing how important media really are and how conceptual interrelationships tend to heal over the diversity of media within which they work. So with that, unless you want to come back on that, and our dream was that we would open now to you and that you would have things you would like to ask us.
We can't have silence here. Really lovely presentation, and I was struck by, I think, the interrelationship on a conceptual level. I want to actually ask, I saw very much how your relationship existed on that level. I want to ask something that will now be, I hope, not deadeningly practical, but Pip, if you were to sort of look at your bit in the studio, were there examples in your relationship where Anne, you felt your concept of Nauman was changed because of what Pip brought?
Well, I think maybe I should underscore how much Pip is able to see in time-based media that I can't see, and how, although apparently we share terminology, what she gave me was the concepts that now our mutual terminology, that inform her side of our mutual terminology. I mean, I think you have to learn to see time-based work, and I had no idea of the fact that structures could be mapped. So basically, everything Pip said to you was something that she taught me. How's that? Pretty sweeping, but that's the force of it.
Maybe I should say something. I think that what this conference did, which was unlike any other experience that I've been through, is it gave me this license to have access to an art historian of the caliber of Anne, and I think actually spend time reflecting on the ideas that I heard in a lecture she gave at UCL, actually what that meant to my work. And so much, and I know, Jill asked the question and Jill gave a beautiful presentation about the issue of time, but the luxury to give yourself, the time and space to really think in depth of the implication of some of the things that one hears from these art historians was actually a really extraordinary experience. And I think that was the genius of the Getty for us. It allowed me to do something that I don't normally do. And I think that's probably the thing that I wanted just to say about the nature of our collaboration over this project.
I mean, one other thing I could say is that to have Pip explain to me how the mapping studio project actually works, and to sort of have force your mind to wrap around this artist who wants this kind of impossible transparency between his medium and what's happening in the world. He wants he sets up the media so it can soak up what's out there in ways that are pretty unique. Then push me back into some of the sculpture by Nauman, which I have had the most difficulty with, and that is his use of animal bodies, which seem initially to be life casts, but actually are taxidermy models. And they were very much he is interested in a kind of direct impress between something and some medium, and that directness that Pip was talking about made me think again of those and about them and how they might fit in with these kinds of arguments, these tentative arguments that we are outlining here. But surely you guys must have more questions than this.
Maybe I could say something about one of the other discussions that Anne and I had was about, I was lucky enough to interview Nauman, and he's a very good storyteller, but you always come away thinking that you got a great story, but perhaps you didn't really get the answer, So I was interested in the fact that I think what Anne said to me was the idea that an artist interview is another text to be interpreted, and I think that I'm quite interested in how we do deal with statements from the artist, and I was very keen to go and interview his editor, and somehow I'm looking for something there that's going to be a clue, and perhaps as conservators we have been weighting those statements in a very different way from an art historian. If you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, well, it may be anathema to say this, but I always believe you should never believe what the artist says, as opposed to finding the truth in it, because it's always a motivated statement. But
that's got to be provocative. Come on.
I'm trying. Or maybe we're out of time, so we don't need to provoke them anymore.
I think since both of these people are on our panel, we can continue this discussion at the panel. So thank you very much at this point.